the city of Vienna adored Countess Maria von Hohenberg. She was the widow who dressed in muted silks, who carried prayer books in her hands, who bent her head in piety whenever she entered the cathedral. The poor whispered blessings upon her name, for it was said she opened her home to abandoned children, offering them food, shelter, and a chance at survival. But the truth of her house was known only to her, and the truth was that charity was never the purpose. The perfumes she ordered by the barrel were not indulgence but necessity, for the corridors of her grand home reeked of something that perfume alone could never drown. Beneath the sweetness of roses and lavender clung a sourness that never faded, a scent of bodies kept too long in silence. The neighbors dismissed it as medical tonics, for the Countess was known to study with physicians, but others whispered darker things when they walked past her gates at night. Maria carried herself with the stillness of someone who never allowed her mind to rest. She was methodical even in her devotion, kneeling for hours in prayer before the altar she had built in her private chambers, candles burning down to wax puddles on the floor. She prayed not for salvation, but for order, for clarity, for control. In her mind, chaos was sin, and children with their unpredictable cries and laughter were chaos made flesh. She sought to quiet them, to mold them, to strip away the noise of the world until what remained was pure stillness. When the city applauded her for housing the unwanted, they never imagined that her true ambition was to create silence so complete that it could be touched, handled, and preserved. At her banquets, she displayed a grace that left nobles charmed. She spoke of God's mercy and the emperor's wisdom, reminding all that society's greatness rested on the care of its weakest members. Yet behind closed doors, she took notes in a neat, tight hand, recording every quiver of fear in the orphans she brought under her roof. She catalogued the way a child's body reacted to hunger, to isolation, to the sudden sting of cold iron pressed against their skin. She timed how long it took for sobs to turn to whispers and whispers into silence. Each entry in her journals read like scripture, a litany of suffering transformed into data. She believed that silence was not the absence of sound, but the perfection of discipline, and to reach it she had to carve away everything noisy, everything human. It began with small rituals. She would take a child into her chamber and demand stillness while they stood before her, hands clasped, feet together. If they fidgeted, she pricked their skin with the sharp end of her embroidery needles, watching the sting tighten their faces until obedience took hold. If they wept, she made them kneel on grains of rice scattered across marble floors, waiting until the pain forced them to stop. The servants who assisted her told themselves these were only lessons in discipline. But as the weeks passed, some children never returned from her chambers at all. Maria explained their absence with calm lies, telling visitors that the children had been placed with families elsewhere, that their futures were secure, and the city believed her, because belief was easier than suspicion. The scent betrayed her more than once. When carriages approached the manor, the odor of flowers hung heavy in the air. Yet underneath it lay a chemical sharpness, a trace of something unnatural. A few visitors felt a nausea they could not name, but Maria's smile disarmed them, and her composure suggested innocence beyond question. To accuse her would have meant accusing the idea of charity itself. Still, rumors crept through alleys and taverns. whispers that children vanished after entering her gates, that the Countess loved them too quietly, too permanently. But Vienna was a city of spectacles, and it was easier to celebrate her than to look beneath the perfumed silence she so carefully arranged. For Maria, the performance of innocence was not a mask but an art. Every kind gesture was calculated, every prayer spoken aloud rehearsed to perfection. The deeper truth lay hidden behind the velvet curtains of her manner, where her experiments would soon outgrow the simple pricks and punishments of childhood lessons. Her hunger for silence was evolving into something darker, something that required more than discipline. It required ritual. It required permanence. And in the stilled halls of her house, the scent of formaldehyde lingered as a promise of what was yet to come. Vienna glittered with pageantry when Countess Maria von Hohenberg stepped into the grand halls of Schönbrunn Palace. The chandeliers bathed everything in light so bright it erased shadows, as though even darkness itself bowed before the emperor's gaze. Maria moved with practiced grace, her pale hands folded neatly in front of her, her eyes lowered just enough to appear humble yet proud. Around her, noblemen and their wives whispered admiration. The Countess had become the embodiment of Joseph II's dream of enlightened rule, a woman who had turned her fortune and her grief into mercy for abandoned children. Her orphan house was called a model for the empire, an experiment in moral duty. But within her mind, as she stood among marble columns and golden candelabras, she saw not mercy but control, not children but vessels, bodies to be arranged and reshaped until they obeyed the order she craved. The emperor himself congratulated her in front of the court, praising her charitable devotion. He spoke of her as an angel to the poor, her home as a refuge for those who had no future. Maria accepted the words with lowered lashes, the perfect portrait of modesty. Yet while courtiers applauded, she studied the children she had brought as her offering. 6 of them stood at her side, scrubbed clean, dressed in pale linen, their faces expressionless after days of drilling in silence. To the onlookers, they were the rescued. To Maria, they were instruments of proof, evidence that her methods worked. She had chosen them carefully, selecting not for beauty or spirit, but for pliability. She liked those whose eyes had already dulled, whose bodies no longer resisted her hands. Behind the glow of the chandeliers, her private gaze dissected them as if they were livestock. She noted the symmetry of their skulls, the way their shoulders drooped after standing too long, the silence they kept even when a cough tickled their throats. In her hidden notebook, she had already measured each one with meticulous precision. She recorded the width of bones, the resilience of skin under pressure, the color of blood after fasting compared to after feasting. Every mark was logged, not as a physician's research, but as scripture to her own design. Where others saw fragile children, Maria saw raw material, a collection of bodies whose suffering could be weighed and compared until truth emerged. The nobles were charmed by her, but not blind to her control. Some whispered that the children behaved more like trained pets than humans, moving when she raised a hand, freezing when her voice lowered. Maria encouraged these whispers, for she knew they bred awe, not suspicion. To her mind, obedience was a kind of beauty, and beauty was the closest humanity could come to perfection. Yet her obsession twisted deeper each time she stood in public. The applause of the court did not satisfy her. It only reminded her of the work that remained unseen. What delighted her most was not the praise of Joseph II, but the knowledge that beneath the surface of her manor, other children lay silent in her care, their voices stolen, their bodies transformed by the small torments she had inflicted with such calm. Her notebooks, bound in dark leather, held the truths that Vienna could never see. She wrote of her experiments with a steady hand, timing how long a child could hold still before trembling, noting the minute details of resistance. She tested endurance by submerging them in icy baths and recording the hour their skin turned blue. She calculated the threshold between whimper and collapse, fascinated by the moment when spirit gave way to surrender. Each line of her notes read with the tone of a scientist, but it was not science that guided her. It was ritual. She believed that by controlling every detail of their pain, she stripped away chaos and revealed order. Silence was not the byproduct of suffering, but the goal itself, a silence that could outlive death. The emperor's praise that evening was her triumph, but it also deepened her hunger. As courtiers toasted her name, Maria imagined bringing more children into her house, not to rescue them, but to refine them. She saw herself creating a generation of bodies molded in quiet, stripped of defiance, catalogued in flesh and bone until perfection was achieved. Every clink of a glass at court became to her ears the ticking of a clock, reminding her how little time she had before curiosity might turn to suspicion. She would have to work faster, conceal more, bury deeper. Yet she felt no fear. If anything, she felt chosen. That night, as the carriages rolled away from Schönbrunn, Maria returned home to her perfumed corridors. The children she had displayed were rewarded with warm broth, though the liquid carried bitter powder that numbed their tongues and dulled their thoughts. As they drifted into heavy sleep, she opened her notebooks and wrote of the day, not of the emperor's gratitude, but of the angle of a boy's spine, the curve of a girl's cheek, the way silence clung to them even in the presence of gold and power. She wrote until her candle burned low, her script precise, her satisfaction absolute. In Vienna, people would continue to believe her charity was a gift for the emperor, an example of mercy turned to law. But in truth, it was the emperor himself who was her gift. His approval gave her legitimacy, his trust gave her protection, his applause gave her the power to continue. The gold chandeliers of the palace had blessed her methods, and with that blessing she felt emboldened to reach further into the abyss. The children were no longer just orphans. They were instruments of an empire, their silence purchased with suffering, their futures sealed in her hands. And as the city slept, the Countess planned her next rituals where measurement would no longer be enough, where the search for silence would demand the orchestration of pain so complete it would blur the line between body and soul. The house of Countess Maria von Hohenberg became less a home and more a chamber of order. By now, the orphans who passed through its gates never saw the promise of schooling or guardianship. They were stripped of laughter first, then of identity, until they became little more than flesh under her gaze. Maria's obsession had grown beyond drills of stillness or parades of obedience. It had evolved into ritual, into something she named within her notebooks as the harmonies of blood. To her mind, silence could be crafted, shaped like a sculpture if the body were handled with patience and discipline. Pain was not cruelty but purification, and death itself was only a final moment of stillness that could be preserved. She began with intervals, measuring the flow of life as if it were music. A child was tied carefully to a wooden chair, the ropes drawn firm but without chaos. She would cut shallow lines into their arms and note how long the blood pulsed before weakening, how the breath quickened then slowed, then broke into whimpers that became nothing at all. Maria believed this sequence was not a tragedy but a hymn, a quiet melody of surrender. She recorded the time of every heartbeat as though composing a score. The children who lasted longer were praised in her journals as resonant. Those who gave out too quickly dismissed as weak tones. She drained them not to kill immediately but to prolong the silence, to orchestrate the slow vanishing of sound itself. The corpses became her second obsession. She could not bear for silence to end with death, so she turned to preservation. Apothecaries across Vienna supplied her with crude chemicals, spirits, salts, and formalin meant for medical curiosities, which she adapted with grotesque creativity. The bodies of children once emptied of struggle were soaked in these mixtures and stored upright in niches behind her manor's walls. She sealed them with lime and plaster, hiding them within the architecture as though her house itself fed upon them. The stench seeped through the floors despite the perfumes she burned, a chemical sweetness that carried through the corridors and lingered in the servants' lungs. For Maria, the scent was no nuisance but a blessing. It meant her silence endured. Her experiments became ceremonies. She called them vigils, evenings when candles filled her private chapel and the chosen child was laid upon a slab of cold stone. She would mark their skin with chalk, tracing lines that followed veins and joints as though sketching a map. Then she would drain them in patterns, first from the wrists, then from the thighs, each cut placed with surgical calm. She listened as the voice faded, as the sobs turned to gasps, then to nothing. She insisted that the moment before death was not loss but perfection, a silence so pure it seemed eternal. She wrote in her journals that each child's silence added to a chorus she alone could hear, a harmony built not of sound but of absence. The servants saw things they dared not speak of. They carried buckets of red water down hidden staircases, poured quicklime over stained stones, and kept their eyes low. Some prayed at night, others drank to forget, yet none fled. To work in the house of the Countess meant security, and to leave would mean suspicion. They endured the odor, the stains, the trembling of children led into chambers who never came back out. Their silence mirrored the silence Maria demanded, and in their fear they too became part of her ritual. The psychological toll on the children was a torment deeper than the blades she pressed to their skin. They learned that noise brought punishment, that crying meant longer drills, that pleading made her hands grow colder, slower, more deliberate. The older ones tried to protect the younger, but resistance only sharpened her interest. She adored the sight of defiance breaking down, the way pride gave way to desperation, and desperation gave way to surrender. To her it was proof that her order was stronger than chaos, that her ritual triumphed over nature. She did not see children. She saw unfinished works of silence, each one an instrument to be tuned. The deaths piled upon each other with rhythm, one blending into the next. Maria tracked them with the precision of a mathematician, recording the exact intervals of life and silence. She counted each one not as a crime, but as a completed composition, an offering to the empire, to God, and to herself. The walls of her house thickened with the weight of embalmed bodies, yet she walked her corridors without dread. Where others might hear echoes, she believed she heard stillness vibrating, a harmony of the dead that reassured her she was fulfilling a higher purpose. And so the house itself changed. No longer a mansion, it became a mausoleum wrapped in silk and gold. The perfumes did not sweeten it, but deepened the unease, for visitors felt their stomachs turn even as they praised her charity. The Countess never wavered in her composure, never broke from her rehearsed gestures of kindness. But within her, the rituals tightened their grip. Each vigil, each drained child, each preserved corpse bound her more firmly to the belief that silence was truth, and truth required sacrifice. In Vienna, whispers spread that children sent to her care were never seen again, but no one spoke aloud what they suspected. The emperor had praised her, the court had blessed her, and so the people turned their eyes away. The Countess had created a world where evil thrived not in shadows but behind the curtains of charity masked by the applause of society. And as the last candle in her chapel guttered out, Maria smiled at the silence that filled the room, knowing that the next vigil would bring her closer to the eternal stillness she believed she alone could command. The Countess had turned her manor into a house of silence, but silence alone was not enough. In her mind, it needed to be shown, displayed, proven to those who still clung to illusions of charity and order. Thus, she created the marionette room, a chamber hidden behind velvet drapes and carved wood panels, accessible only to those she invited under the mask of science. By day, it appeared to be an unused gallery. By night, it became her private stage where children were transformed into living mannequins, bodies arranged into postures that erased their humanity and turned them into objects of control. The room reeked of iron and oil, for Maria had commissioned blacksmiths to craft hooks and chains disguised as medical devices. She told them they were for orthopedic correction, the kind of tools physicians were experimenting with across Europe, and the craftsmen, blinded by her noble name, never questioned the purpose. Once installed, the contraptions became instruments of her performance. Small bodies were lifted by shoulders, ribs, and spines forced into stiff vertical poses that twisted their joints until cracks echoed in the chamber. Their faces contorted with pain, yet Maria demanded stillness. To her, the breaking of bone was not failure, but proof of weakness being reshaped into order. The gatherings she held were dressed in words of enlightenment. She invited select noblemen and whispered of demonstrations in the study of discipline, in the cultivation of silence. They entered expecting lectures and curiosities, the kind that the age of reason had promised. And though their stomachs clenched at what they saw, none dared denounce her. For what was revealed to them was presented as knowledge, cloaked in the language of progress. Maria spoke calmly, her pale hands gesturing toward the strung-up children as though describing a painting. She explained the importance of posture, the purity of composure, the triumph of the body over chaos. Her words dulled the horror until even those who trembled convinced themselves they were witnessing discovery, not torment. But what they did not see, or perhaps refused to see, was the second ritual beneath the first. For Maria did not merely display the children's suffering. She ensured they lived every moment of it. She employed early toxins, extracts from plants studied in apothecaries, to paralyze muscles while keeping the mind awake. The child whose body was pinned on hooks could not scream, could not move, but their eyes burned with terror as every joint dislocated, as every bone pressed against the unnatural pull. Maria considered this paralysis an art form, a way of perfecting silence while ensuring awareness remained intact. For her, it was not enough that the body was stilled. The soul had to witness its own surrender. The psychological weight on the victims was unbearable. To be forced into statues while still conscious meant their suffering was both endless and invisible. No one in the chamber would hear their cries, for their throats were frozen. No one would see their pleas, for their faces were stiffened by the toxin. Only their eyes betrayed the torment, and even then Maria trained her guests not to look too closely. She insisted that their gaze remain on posture, on symmetry, on the illusion of calm. In this way, she made her victims invisible even as they stood in plain sight, their agony dismissed as nothing more than an experiment in discipline. The noblemen left these gatherings unsettled, their thoughts colliding between disgust and awe. They did not understand fully, but neither did they challenge her. To accuse her would mean admitting they had witnessed it, and to admit they had witnessed it would stain their names forever. And so the silence Maria demanded in her house infected them as well. Their compliance fed her hunger, convincing her that she was chosen, not condemned, that her rituals were not acts of madness but of revelation. She believed she had built a chamber where truth revealed itself, where suffering stripped away the noise of the world and left behind only the order she craved. For the children, there was no escape. Those who survived the first exhibitions often did not survive the second. Bones that healed crooked were broken again, muscles already weakened were stretched to snapping, and those who endured were kept alive only long enough to serve another night's performance. Maria never wasted what she preserved. When a child's body finally collapsed under strain, she embalmed them as she had the others, arranging them as permanent marionettes along the back walls, their hollow eyes staring outward as warnings to the living. To her, these preserved figures were not corpses but monuments to silence, eternal dolls who testified to the strength of her rituals. The marionette room became the black heart of her manor, a place where innocence was twisted into spectacle, where order was carved into flesh with iron and poison. Each demonstration confirmed her belief that she alone had pierced the veil between chaos and harmony, that her pursuit of silence was not cruelty but destiny. Yet with every child lost, the air in her house thickened with the scent of chemicals and rot, a sweetness that perfumes could not disguise. Servants grew pale and fearful. Noblemen whispered uneasily after they left, and still Maria smiled. Blind to decay, deaf to doubt, consumed only by the perfection of her silent chorus. And as the last candlelight of each night flickered across the iron hooks, the Countess would stand in her marionette room, studying the still bodies swaying gently under their chains. She felt no guilt, no horror, only pride, for in their silence she heard the harmony she had always sought. To her they were no longer children, they were instruments of truth, strung upon her wires, played by her hands and silenced into eternity. Maria's hunger for silence had reached its height in the marionette room, but silence alone soon lost its meaning. It was not enough for her to strip sound away. She wanted to command it, to reshape it, to make it her instrument. What began as a fascination with stillness twisted into an obsession with voices. She could not bear the idea that children's cries and final breaths dissolved into the air, wasted, forgotten. To her, every scream carried a resonance that should be captured, purified, and harnessed. And so she turned her gaze from the posture of bones to the tension of chords, from the rigidity of limbs to the vibration of flesh. In the basement of her manor, Maria constructed a chamber unlike any the city had seen. She filled it with wooden frames carved with the precision of luthier, strung not with catgut but with the stretched vocal cords of her victims. The first attempts were crude, slivers of tissue pulled too tight, tearing before they could sound. But Maria was patient. She experimented with lengths, with tension, with mixtures of resin and salt that hardened the flesh until it hummed under pressure. The day a single note rang out low and trembling, she wept with joy. To her, this was proof of a divine revelation. The voice of the innocent could live beyond the grave, tamed, ordered, and made eternal. Her instruments became grotesque hybrids, half body, half altar. Children were killed not in haste, but with surgical calculation. She opened their throats with calm precision, harvesting what she needed, recording every step as though compiling scripture. The organs of sound were rinsed in her chemical mixtures, pinned across wooden beams, tightened until they produced tone. Soon her chamber filled with frames that groaned when struck, that whispered when bowed, that shrieked when the air itself moved through them. She named it her red organ, an orchestra of suffering, and she played it not for entertainment but as ritual. Her fingers gliding across flesh as if she were touching the keys of a harpsichord. The sound that emerged was unlike any music Vienna had known. It was a chorus of tones both sharp and hollow, vibrating with a human quality that unsettled all who heard it. Witnesses later spoke of hymns that bled through the walls at night, notes that carried the weight of weeping, harmonies that seemed both sacred and unholy. Servants covered their ears, but Maria leaned into the sound, swaying like a priestess in ecstasy, her eyes closed as if transported beyond the mortal world. She convinced herself that the emperor's vision of enlightenment demanded not only new ideas but new harmonies, music built not on wood and string, but on the raw matter of humanity itself. She began to invite select audiences, always under the guise of scientific demonstration. Her guests were made to sit in candlelit silence while she drew sound from her creations, coaxing from the stretched chords a hymn that resembled a church choir but carried undertones of pain. Some noblemen wept, overcome by a feeling they could not name, unsure if it was reverence or revulsion. Others left pale and shaken, their minds disturbed for weeks afterward by echoes they could not banish. But Maria, watching their trembling hands and glazed eyes, felt only satisfaction. To disturb them was to prove the power of her red organ, to demonstrate that flesh itself could preach truth's words could never hold. The deaths required for these instruments became methodical sacrifices. She did not kill impulsively. She selected with care, measuring throats, listening to voices, humming along to cries as though auditioning them for her orchestra. Those with higher-pitched wails were preserved for brighter tones, those with deeper sobs carved for lower resonance. Children were catalogued by the sounds of their fear, and in their final gasps, Maria believed she found the essence of their souls. She no longer considered herself a murderer but a composer, and each body was a note in her great work. The toll on the victims was unspeakable. They were forced to endure days of rehearsals, Maria pressing her ear to their throats as they screamed, commanding them to sustain tones until their voices cracked. She listened to every change, every rasp, every tremor, making notes before finally silencing them forever. To the children, death was not an end, but a rehearsal completed, their voices stolen and repurposed against their will. They lived in terror not just of pain, but of the knowledge that even in death they would not be free, that their voices would be forced to sing in Maria's eternal choir. The Countess herself sank further into delusion. She believed she was conducting a spiritual orchestra, guiding a music that reached beyond human ears into the realm of angels. The organ filled her with a pride no banquet, no courtly praise could match. She began to dress her chamber like a cathedral, hanging the preserved faces of her victims on the walls as icons, their glassy eyes watching her as she played. To her, they were saints, martyrs of silence and sound, proof that her rituals elevated the weak into something holy. Vienna began to notice the strange music more often. Carriages passing at night reported hearing choirs, though no church bells rang. Notes that echoed from the Countess's estate in tones too raw, too human to be ordinary. Some whispered that angels sang for her. Others that demons had taken her house. Yet no one acted, for to question her was to question the emperor's chosen model of charity. And so the red organ continued, its hymns bleeding into the streets, its songs carrying the voices of the dead, while Maria swayed before it, convinced she had given flesh its true purpose. The marionette room had proven her control, but the red organ gave her power. Through silence she had learned order, but through sound she found immortality. Each tone was a death preserved, each hymn a sermon of torment, and each audience member who left in shivers was to her a witness of truth. In the dim glow of candles the Countess smiled, her hands wet with chemicals and blood, her ears filled with the hymns of her creation. For in her red organ she no longer heard the cries of children. She heard only music, pure and eternal, the harmony of suffering made divine. Maria's mind no longer lingered on silence or sound alone. Her obsession had turned toward purity, a concept she twisted until it became something physical in her eyes, a substance that could be extracted and preserved. To her, children were not merely instruments of discipline or music, but vessels of innocence. And innocence was something she believed must be torn out through ritual before it was spoiled by the world. She convinced herself that each act of suffering refined their purity, separating it from the filth of their mortal bodies. What others called cruelty, she named lessons. What others would call death, she named purification. The rituals she devised in this new obsession blurred the line between science and sacrament. She began with boiling milk, filling copper tubs until the steam choked the chamber and the air grew thick with the sour, sweet scent of scalded liquid. The children were stripped and lowered in, their flesh blistering as soon as it touched the surface, their bodies thrashing until she pinned them with rods of iron. Maria told herself that the milk was a holy bath, a cleanser that drew out the stains of sin through the bubbling of skin. She timed how long it took for screams to weaken, how the eyes glazed over as the flesh peeled, and she wrote each detail in her notebooks with the steadiness of a physician. The victims were not named, only labeled by number and result, their innocence measured in suffering. When the milk baths no longer satisfied her, she turned to mercury. Apothecaries sold it as medicine, but Maria saw in it a different purpose. She filled long needles with quicksilver and drove them into the spines of her victims. The children convulsed at first, their legs twitching uncontrollably, then slowly stilled as paralysis spread like a slow fire from their lower backs to their throats. She studied every stage with rapt attention, the spasms, the shallow breathing, the terror in their eyes as they realized their bodies no longer belonged to them. Some lingered for hours, trapped in silence, unable to scream though their minds still begged for release. Maria called this the perfect lesson, for it forced the child to confront purity and stillness, stripped of motion, stripped of sound, left only with the pure terror of awareness. Each act became part of a catalog she kept with almost religious devotion. Her journals grew thick with neat lines describing temperatures, timings, the color of burns, the exact hour paralysis set in. She named the entries not as crimes but as lessons, numbering them like chapters in a holy book. Lesson 12. The skin blisters at 4 minutes, purity rises in vapor. Lesson 21. The spine accepts quicksilver best at the third vertebra. Paralysis complete in 90 minutes. She never recorded emotion, only detail, for emotion was chaos and order was all that mattered. The calmness of her hand contrasted with the horror she inflicted, her handwriting even as her victims writhed in agony before her. The toll on the children became unbearable long before death. They learned to fear every sound of boiling water, every clink of glass vials, every flicker of candlelight in the Countess's chamber. Some tried to flee only to be dragged back and punished with slower torments. Their innocence was shattered not only by the pain but by the certainty that they had been chosen not to be loved, but to be destroyed in the name of purity. Their minds collapsed before their bodies did, and those who lived long enough became hollow-eyed specters waiting for their turn to enter the copper tub or feel the sting of quicksilver. Maria never looked at them as children, never saw their despair. To her, they were ingredients of a larger design, their torment the crucible that separated purity from corruption. The servants too suffered under the weight of her delusion. They carried the tubs of milk, their hands blistered from steam, and they cleaned the syringes streaked with silver. They could not speak of what they saw, for to admit it aloud would destroy them, so they swallowed the guilt until it sickened them. Some took to muttering prayers, but even prayer could not mask the smell of scalded flesh that hung in the manor's walls. They became unwilling accomplices in her rituals, their silence another layer of cruelty that fed Maria's belief that her work was holy. And through it all, Maria grew more convinced that she was chosen. She believed she was not killing, but distilling, pulling from the ruined bodies the essence of innocence, and locking it into her journals, her rituals, her memory. Every act was another step toward perfection, another demonstration that order could be carved from chaos with fire, with metal, with poison. To her, the suffering of the children was not a stain, but a sacrifice, proof that innocence could be remade in silence and pain. The anatomy of innocence, as Maria came to call it, was never about saving souls, but about breaking them, reducing them to parts she could handle, catalog, and preserve. And as she looked over her copper tubs and her syringes of mercury, the Countess smiled with the serenity of a saint, blind to the ruin she left behind. She saw only purity gleaming in her mind like light through stained glass, while in truth the house grew darker, the walls heavier with the weight of suffering, the air thicker with the ghosts of children who never had a chance to live beyond her hands. The fire started quietly, a smoldering ember beneath the floorboards of the east wing, invisible at first to those accustomed to the shadows of Maria's manor. By the time the smoke clawed its way through gilded corridors, the tenants and servants had fled, leaving only the wind and the smell of burning timber to announce the danger. Flames licked the ceilings, and the townsfolk, drawn by the orange glow against the night sky, surged toward the estate with buckets and shovels, their faces lit with terror and curiosity in equal measure. When the front doors were pried open, they stumbled into a world they could scarcely comprehend, a house that smelled of smoke, rot, and something far older. Something chemical and metallic, a stench that clawed at the throat and left nausea in its wake. They followed the heat into hallways that led not to bedrooms or libraries, but to hidden chambers, to walls lined with wax-sealed coffins, their surfaces gleaming in the firelight as though polished for an altar. Each coffin revealed its secret with horrifying clarity. Children, some no older than 7, lay suspended within, their limbs stiffened by chemicals, their faces frozen in expressions that were neither pain nor peace, but some unnatural limbo between life and death. Others were encased in clear liquids, the fluid preserving skin and hair in uncanny fidelity, as if time itself had been held back for the Countess's own inspection. Eyes, though closed, seemed to stare through the glass and wax, accusing and pleading at once, leaving the onlookers staggered with disbelief. The townsfolk recoiled, some vomited into the corridors, some screamed for help, while others, compelled by the same morbid fascination that had drawn Maria to her work, touched the surfaces of the coffins only to recoil at the chill and the weight of preservation that seemed to press through the wax. The walls themselves, once silent, now seemed to hum with the echo of suffering, as if the methodical cruelty recorded within them could not be contained even by fire. Panic spread rapidly beyond the manor, racing through the streets of Vienna with a speed no one could match. Mothers clutched children tighter. Noblemen demanded answers from the city guard, and whispers began to weave a tapestry of horror. Missing children from wealthy households, the sudden disappearances from the orphanages Maria had so publicly showcased, all linked by rumor to the manor now smoking and weeping from the fire. Some spoke of the Countess's past invitations to the Emperor's court, of her charitable works praised under gilded chandeliers, now reinterpreted in the flickering light of horror as ceremonies of exploitation and death. The more the fire revealed, the more the city trembled, as if the very streets had sensed the systematic extraction of innocence, the precise orchestration of agony that had taken place behind doors long closed to the public eye. The discovery forced the imperial hand. Emperor Joseph II, long a patron of reform and enlightenment, found himself confronted with a nightmare too grotesque to ignore. The stench of chemicals and decay reached him even before the details did, a pungent metallic aroma that invaded the palace when reports arrived. He could not dismiss the allegations as rumor, for the images carried on trembling hands, wax-stained and liquid-filled, left no space for doubt. Each coffin, each suspended body, each careful arrangement that Maria had crafted as ritual or lesson became evidence of a mind both brilliant and monstrously deranged. The emperor's aides whispered of her meticulous notebooks, now seized by authorities, pages filled with measurements, observations, and justifications, all written with a calm hand that belied the atrocities recorded. The psychological toll on the survivors was immediate and raw. Servants, some of whom had labored in fear for decades, were summoned to recount what they had witnessed, their hands shaking and voices breaking as the memories returned. They spoke of children who were never taught letters or prayers, only instructed in the bodily mechanics of suffering, of the smell of mercury and burning milk, of silence enforced through methods that left them permanently scarred. Their recollections were not linear but fragmented, each image of ritualized torment clashing with another, as if the very nature of Maria's cruelty had splintered their minds in advance of the law's intervention. Even the investigators felt a creeping dread, the methodical precision of Maria's cruelty leaving no place untouched, no corner safe from contamination by fear. And yet Maria herself was not immediately found among the ruins. The fire had spared her private chambers, and for a moment it seemed as though the architect of these horrors might escape the mortal consequences of her designs. When she was finally apprehended, her composure was unbroken, her handwriting neat even in the margin notes she carried, as though the disaster outside had no bearing on the internal world she had cultivated for decades. She spoke in no voice, gave no explanation, but in the silence of her gaze lay the unshakable certainty of a mind convinced of its righteousness, the ultimate lesson unlearned even in the face of discovery. By dawn, Vienna was consumed with both grief and fear. The emperor ordered the coffins sealed for inspection, the surviving children removed to safer quarters, and an inquiry initiated that would forever stain the reputation of the countess. Whispers of the red organ, of boiling milk baths, of mercury and paralytic toxins began to circulate with a feverish intensity, each story feeding the city's panic. What had been hidden behind gilded doors was now undeniable. Maria's devotion to order and purity had transformed into a cathedral of horror, its walls preserved in wax, its lessons recorded in ink, and its echoes haunting every witness long after the fire had been extinguished. The anatomy of innocence, the orchestration of death, and the meticulous cataloging of suffering had been unveiled, leaving a city trembling and an emperor forced to confront the unspeakable. And in that confrontation it became clear that while fire could expose the walls, it could not burn away the methodical cruelty that had long taken root within them. The Habsburg court had never seen a figure like Maria, nor a spectacle so grotesque as the one presented within its marble walls. Dragged into the chamber on the arms of guards, she walked with a deliberate calm, her posture rigid, eyes fixed forward as though the courtroom itself were merely a backdrop for her own performance. Outside, Vienna's streets were alive with rumor, each whisper heavier than the last. Children suspended in wax, organs repurposed as instruments, paralytic toxins, boiling milk baths, the metallic tang of mercury still haunting the memories of those who survived. The nobles and officials, accustomed to scandal contained in whispered affairs or political treachery, recoiled at the methodical precision of her deeds, the almost surgical attention to torment that had become her signature. Maria did not flinch under the gaze of the emperor, nor under the scrutiny of witnesses whose hands shook and voices fractured as they recounted horrors their minds had struggled to contain for months. She spoke only once, her voice calm, measured, carrying the weight of conviction rather than fear. She described suffering as a revelation, a crucible through which the truth of the human soul was exposed. To her, the children were instruments of inquiry, their pain a map to hidden realities that no ordinary life could illuminate. Each act of cruelty had been catalogued with care, every body preserved, every note recorded, every ritual executed with the precision of an orchestra conductor guiding a symphony. The court and the Europe that would hear of her trial struggled to reconcile the soft-spoken elegance of her language with the monstrosities she had confessed. What struck the witnesses most forcibly, what clawed at their memory even as they testified, was her absence of remorse, the almost clinical detachment with which she described baths of boiling milk, mercury needles through spines, children stretched upon iron hooks until bones shattered like porcelain. As testimony unfolded, the court was inundated with evidence too horrifying for ordinary comprehension. Witnesses described rooms filled with wax-sealed coffins, liquid-preserved bodies suspended like saints trapped in memory, and the marionette room, where children had been posed as grotesque mannequins, their spines locked in impossible angles, injected with paralytic toxins to simulate death, while their consciousness remained intact. Some officials refused to look, covering their faces, yet others could not tear their eyes away, each glimpse reinforcing the unbearable truth of the methodical evil that had taken place behind Maria's doors. She had turned innocence into study, joy into ritual, sound into agony, and the court could feel the psychic weight of each child's suffering pressing through the pages of her meticulous notes. Nobles whispered among themselves of the red organ. Organs stretched across frames to produce music, the sound of children's voices twisted into hymns that had once echoed through hidden halls in the Countess's manor. The descriptions were delivered with hesitation, as if speech alone could summon the horrors again, and yet they could not remain silent. Each story built upon the last, forming a tapestry of pain and fascination that enveloped the courtroom in an oppressive atmosphere, a living shadow of the manor itself. Those who had been servants, who had carried the corpses or administered the poisons, broke down completely, sobbing in the presence of aristocracy, recounting the precise steps of rituals that had become their daily lives, their minds scarred not only by what they had seen but by the necessity of performing cruelty under the gaze of Maria's unyielding authority. Despite the volume of testimony, the emperor and his council worked to control the narrative. Records were edited or suppressed, certain details excised, the monarchy's image prioritized even amid scandals so immense that it threatened the very fabric of public trust. Yet the witnesses persisted, and in the gaps, the full horror leaked, infecting conversation, drawing gasps from courtiers who could not reconcile the civility of Vienna's elite with the deliberate orchestration of agony described before them. The preserved dolls of flesh, the baths of boiling milk, the instruments made from organs. These were not accidents of cruelty, but carefully conceived, sustained over years with unwavering devotion. To Maria, each act was an experiment, a lesson, a spiritual and scientific pursuit. To Europe, each act was a revelation of a darkness no one had dared name aloud. Observers noted the psychological toll on those called to testify. Some could not bear to see Maria in the flesh, trembling as they recounted details, their memories jagged and unspooling in erratic bursts of emotion. Others, hardened by necessity, spoke in measured tones, but the trauma lingered in subtle ways. Fingers trembling, eyes darting to imagined corners, pauses where the memory of scent or sound returned. Even those tasked with documenting proceedings felt the weight of her methodical cruelty, the sense that the evil had been executed with an intellect and precision that transcended normal human depravity. The Countess's calm, her unbroken hand, and her insistence that suffering revealed truth became a lens through which everyone present saw the fractures of innocence, the fragility of life, and the relentless machinery of her mind. By the end of the trial, the court was left in a state of uneasy awe and horror. Europe would remember Maria not for charm or intelligence alone, but for the orchestration of suffering, the unflinching control she wielded over life and death, and the sheer audacity of her belief that torment could be a pathway to revelation. The shadow of the manor, of wax and liquid and bone, stretched across Vienna and beyond, leaving a city and a continent to confront what it meant when methodical evil hid behind civility, and when the most monstrous truths were delivered with a calm, almost courteous hand. In the years that followed, the corridors of Maria's manor were emptied, swept clean. Yet the stench of her meticulous cruelty lingered in Vienna's collective memory. Official records erased her name. Officials insisted the estate had been merely abandoned, the children gone under mysterious circumstances. But the truth permeated the city in whispers, in the shadowed corners of orphanages and hospitals, in the hushed conversations of physicians who had studied the limits of pain and preservation and found themselves morally unmoored. Laws were quietly amended to govern the treatment of orphans, to restrict the unchecked ambitions of those claiming scientific or spiritual authority. But these changes came not from moral awakening alone. They were born from fear, the recognition that methodical evil could nest behind civility, could masquerade as charity, as refinement, as the calm hand of a woman claiming to extract purity from flesh. Physicians debated ethics for decades, their lectures and treatises haunted by the precision of her cruelty, her notes a catalogue of horrors that weighed on their minds. The meticulous documentation a reminder that monstrosity need not shout to be heard. In orphanages, new rules were whispered in training rooms, lessons carved out in policy manuals, yet the air still carried an unspoken dread. Caretakers remembered the stories, how children could be suspended on hooks and injected with toxins, how organs could become instruments, how boiling milk could extract the substance of innocence. And those memories dictated cautious behavior, a pervasive vigilance that shaped the architecture of compassion itself. Memorials were built quietly, small plaques tucked behind convent doors or hidden in gardens where only the most observant might notice the names of children who had never grown old, their lives compressed into the stark syllables of records deliberately minimized. Even as centuries passed, the phrase, "the children were away," became a curse whispered at dusk, a reminder that society could hide horrors behind the perfumed guise of order and benevolence, that innocence could vanish while the world looked elsewhere, confident in the civility of its institutions. Maria's methodology became a study, a lesson in the terrifying power of calculated calm. Scholars dissected the psychological mechanics of her crimes, the way she had manipulated perception and trust, the way she had constructed suffering into a precise, ritualistic sequence that left no trace of frenzy but every trace of devastation. Each act, each pause, each deliberate step into torment was designed to create both spectacle and silence, to leave witnesses fractured and guilty, to ensure that horror imprinted itself on consciousness long after the body had been removed or preserved. Psychologists later marveled at her detachment, the way she cataloged each child as a specimen, as an instrument, as a lesson, and yet maintained a serene domesticity, a polished mask of civility that deceived anyone who approached without suspicion. The evil was methodical, its calm as deliberate as a clock's tick, and it became the standard by which future generations measured the subtlety of cruelty, the danger of benevolence wielded without conscience. Hospitals echoed with the memory of her precision. Medical students warned against hubris, and ethicists debated endlessly whether the boundaries of experimentation could ever be properly enforced. Each account of Maria's work became a ghost in lecture halls, a warning that the human mind could rationalize anything if it was performed with elegance, restraint, and an unyielding belief in a higher purpose. Physicians, even those who prided themselves on objectivity, found themselves shivering in the library stacks, reading the transcripts of her trial, the meticulous annotations, the diagrams that traced pain across spines and vocal cords and marrow. They understood then that evil did not need fire to leave scars. It could linger in silence, in ink, in the calculated arrangement of flesh, and in the way the city itself chose to forget while still trembling in memory. Even the streets of Vienna carried her legacy in the perfumed silence of its salons, in the unspoken lessons delivered to every parent, every caretaker, every bureaucrat who had authority over the vulnerable. Children were watched more closely. Gifts of charity became tempered with suspicion, the architecture of care reshaped to prevent repetition. Yet the knowledge that methodical cruelty could hide behind civility never left the collective consciousness. Artists painted dark allegories, writers whispered tales of vanished children and waxed coffins, and the faint echo of hymns played on organs made from ribs seemed to haunt the edges of imagination, a reminder that suffering could be orchestrated into beauty, and that horror could be made to appear as progress. By the end of the century, the question persisted: how much of society's charity and kindness hid masks, and how many of its institutions silently orchestrated suffering for convenience, efficiency, or ideology? Maria was gone, yet her influence endured, not as a figure of grotesque frenzy, but as a blueprint for calm, calculated evil, the kind that leaves no immediate chaos but instead reshapes perception, morality, and conscience over decades. Vienna learned to whisper her lessons rather than scream them, and the children who were away became both ghost and instruction, their absence a symbol of the fragility of innocence and the terrifying potency of methodical cruelty. In the end, the city carried a secret, a perfumed silence in which the past lingered, the quiet terror that civility can shield monstrosity. that the calm hand of a woman, armed with knowledge and conviction, can orchestrate suffering so complete that it resonates for generations. The shadow of Maria remained, not in buildings or monuments alone, but in the vigilance and fear embedded in the hearts of those who would never again trust appearances, who would remember that evil is most effective when it wears a mask, when it whispers rather than shouts, and when society chooses convenience over confrontation.